You hand over your insurance card at the admissions desk while the nurse checks your blood pressure again. The pain started an hour ago, sudden, sharp. You were told not to wait. The hospital says they'll begin treatment immediately. Your policy covers emergency care. That part is clear. They move quickly. Blood tests, scans. A consultant at the bedside explaining next steps. You call the insurer from the corridor just to notify them. The person on the phone sounds calm. If it's emergency treatment, you're covered. You repeat that line to yourself as they wheel you into the next room. The treatment starts that afternoon. The next morning, it pauses. You're told the insurer needs to confirm something before they can continue. At first, you assume it's paperwork catching up. You're already in a bed. You've already had medication. The urgency hasn't changed. You explain that to the administrator. They nod. They say they're waiting for authorization to extend the stay. Extend. That word lands harder than it should. Because what began as an emergency is now being examined as a timeline. The initial treatment was immediate, undisputed. But the question now isn't whether you needed help when you arrived. It's whether what's happening today still qualifies the same way. You're asked when the symptoms first began. Not this morning, weeks ago. Had there been discomfort before? Any appointments? Any advice to monitor it? You answer honestly. There were signs. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that sent you to hospital until yesterday. But the story no longer begins at the moment you walked through the doors. It begins earlier, and earlier changes things. The consultant says they need to wait. The insurer wants records. They want to understand whether this was sudden or developing, whether it counts as an acute episode or the continuation of something else. The pain hasn't changed. The category has. Another version of this happens abroad. You fall on a tiled floor in a hotel lobby. You're taken to a private clinic. X-rays done. A fracture confirmed. The insurer is contacted. Approval is given for emergency stabilization. A cast is fitted. 2 days later, surgery is recommended. The clinic calls again. This time, the response is slower. Questions about previous injuries. About bone density scans from years ago. About whether the fracture was purely accidental or linked to an underlying condition. The cast stays on. The operating theater waits. Or it happens with a sudden infection. High fever. Ambulance. Admission. Antibiotics started within the hour. The first few days are covered without hesitation. Then, as recovery stalls, the insurer reviews. They want to know if this is related to a diagnosis you received last year. If the infection is separate or connected, the treatment that felt urgent now feels negotiable. What makes this shift so unsettling is the order of it. Care begins first. Approval seems implicit in the speed. You relax into the idea that the worst part is being handled. The pause only arrives after you've already trusted the process. No one says you shouldn't have come to hospital. No one says you weren't unwell. The emergency is acknowledged, but the continuation is treated differently, as if urgency has an expiry point. You start to realize that emergency cover is not a single moment. It's a boundary, a line between immediate crisis and ongoing need. And that line isn't drawn by how you feel. It's drawn by how your story is framed. You didn't misrepresent anything. You didn't delay care. You believed that once treatment began under your policy, it would continue under the same understanding. But the system separates beginnings from middles. It pays attention to when something started, not just how it feels now. And once the initial urgency is over, everything is reassessed through a different lens. By the time the authorization comes through, or doesn't, you've already learned something uncomfortable. The emergency wasn't defined by the moment you needed help. It was defined by how narrowly that moment could be contained. You trusted the speed of the first response. You trusted the movement, the machines, the signatures. You thought starting meant covered. But here, starting is the easiest part. The treatment didn't pause because you stopped needing it. It paused because certainty shifted from you to the system. And the moment you felt safest, when care began without hesitation, was the moment the limits of that care were already being measured.